and the Audio Engineering Society and the Acoustical Society of America. His compositions have been performed at Shamus, Spark Festival, and Florida Electroacoustic Music Festivals. Much recent work has been centered on energetic healing through music and includes spatial sound installations. He's a student of Andean shamanism and has trained as an energetic healer through studies with Amora Kwan Yi. Please welcome Gary Kendall.
So I'm very happy to be here. I happen to be on a sabbatical semester right now, and when I thought about planning what I was going to do with the first sabbatical semester I ever had, one of the things I knew that I wanted to do was to come here to have the chance to chat with Curtis, who I hadn't chatted with for a while, but also to experience the presentation I did at the International Computer Music Conference just some months ago. And the way that this came up, is that I'm on the faculty of the Sonic Arts Research Center. We've got a lot of composers, and after a while, they started coming to me asking me questions. And sometimes I would listen to their questions, and it would just seem obvious to me that they needed help sort of understanding some fundamentals about spatial audio, because very often they were attempting things that I knew didn't work. So I started keeping a little list of things that came up that I thought were really good questions and things that didn't work. But I think I know, Curtis knows, that a lot of composers, over the decades of the history of computer music, have attempted to do things with the spatiality of sound that never worked. I mean, they describe things, they said what their intentions were, and then you would listen, and you would say, well, maybe that's interesting, but there's a disconnect between the description and what you actually heard. So it's been a perennial problem. So anyway, it kind of inspired me to take this approach to talking about spatial audio, to talk about things in terms of, problems that come up, and mostly thinking about young composers who maybe haven't had the decades of experience trying things that don't work, and then, maybe we do a little bit of a shortcut here. So, my experience is that composers engaged in sonic arts, have frequently found themselves attempting to use spatial audio in ways that didn't work as intended. So the situation I observe is that learning to master spatial audio is a tentative process in which one slowly discovers what doesn't work. This learning process, to me, then reflects a lack of conceptual foundation that could guide the composer when conceiving spatial ideas and when translating them into practice. Then, too, I think another reason why this happens is it's easy to be misled by preconceptions of how spatial audio should work, especially visually influenced preconceptions. And you think about things the way you see them, and then you imagine the sound will work the same way, and, well, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. So the purpose of this presentation, then, is to foster an understanding of spatial audio through examples of practical problems. And spatial audio, seems so easy on the face of it, but the ease with which we think about space in everyday life, I think is a miscue to how easily spatial ideas can be translated into spatial audio. And if you think about how we navigate the world, if you think about how our language is infused with spatial analogies and how key spatial thinking and spatial reasoning is to so much of everything we do, that's so easy and that's so effortless. You imagine that things that you want to do with audio are going to be just as easy, but of course it's a more complicated problem.
Gary, also, we have an architect here sitting in the front row.
Oh, great.
So
okay.
Spatial person.
Okay. Yes, maybe there's similarities or parallels with students of architecture. And so one important point is that not every spatial idea can be reverse engineered into sound. Okay, if we think about our spatial reasoning capacities and our spatial intelligence, our inherent spatial intelligence is very multimodal. And we take in experience in the auditory domain, the visual domain, the tactile domain, and we form a kind of a central repertoire of how things work in terms of space. You know, a child growing up is testing the world and trying things and learning about how space works, you know, and that becomes something which is an integration of input from the senses. So we all carry around in us a sense of spatiality that's, you know, basically multimodal, and then you want to reverse engineer an idea which is a multimodal, based on a multimodal concept of space, reverse engineer it into sound. Well, not everything that you can think of will work in terms of auditory perception. So it's important, I think, then, that, you know, our expectations of spatial audio ought to be in some kind of alignment with the fundamentals of how spatial hearing actually works. So it's really important to know, then, how the spatiality of hearing works. So let's start with a frequent misconception. You know, in spite of all the writings that people have done about this, what listeners perceive in terms of spatial audio is not well described as a point source. And, you know, localization blur is one of the terms that tries to capture a measure of a listener's ability to discriminate spatial directions. So I've got a couple of diagrams here from Blauert's book on spatial hearing.
Okay,
Just
Karen,
go ahead.
could you maybe explain for some people what you mean by point source? Some people might not know
So
what that is.
okay, that's a good question. In the common way I often hear people discussing sound, they want to imagine, or they conceive that the way that you hear sound in space is analogous to the way you see a point in space. Mm-hmm. That there's a point in space, and visually you've got a lot of spatial resolution. I can really tell one degree of difference in where a point is in space. And there's you know, people have the concept that a sound is going to emanate, and you're going to perceive it as if it's coming from a point. Okay, and you know, visually, if I have a performer playing off in the distance from me, someone's playing a trumpet, I can see where the trumpet is. I know that there's a point in space associated with where the trumpet is, but what do I hear? What if I couldn't see the trumpet player, for instance? So what do we know just from some very simple psychoacoustic experiments? Well, here's you know, sort of a diagram of a listener's head facing forward that way. And you want to know if something's in front of the listener, how much accuracy do they actually have in figuring out where it is? How much accuracy is there? And it turns out this is the most accurate region in all spatial hearing. It's right dead in front of you. And the accuracy is about plus and minus 3.6 degrees. That means that when something's right in front of you, you have no more sense of where it is than what plus or minus 3.6 degrees tells you. Now, that could be that, you know, it sounds like it's very focused in space, but I really can't tell where it is, or it actually sounds like it occupies some space and it's somewhere in that region. But people don't perceive the direction of sound any more accurately than that. That's the best we've got. That's very, very different from the visual system. And if you go off to the sides, well, here in this experiment, off to the left side of this goofy listener, it was plus or minus 9.2 degrees, or off to the right side was plus or minus 10 degrees. That means when a sound source is off to my right side and I'm trying to imagine where it is, my ability to tell where it is no better than plus or minus 10 degrees.
20 degrees.
20 degrees. It's a 20-degree range there. And that's, you know, that's to one standard deviation. Okay, so some people will actually be more inaccurate than that. So, yeah, that's as good as it gets.
Could you just say a little bit about what's the experimental setup that would produce that kind of a result? The person's like sitting immobilized and they hear a
Sitting
tone
immobilized, no. If there's, I would say, if there's other information present that would help you to localize the sound, you know, then that other information might be gathered in. But here we're talking about, you know, basically a blind experiment where listeners are looking forward and there's a variety of locations to where the actual physical sound source is arising. Okay, so it's pure auditory, no supporting information, no mobility involved. Okay.
Why is there a difference from left to right? Is it like
It was
the
just
experiment
the way-
was one person or?
Well, I think this was done with a small collection of subjects. And why did the left and right turn out there? Well, it just did, you know, in this case. Okay. You know, human beings are notoriously, you know, inconsistent, you know. One other interesting fact here is that the localization blur in the back of the listener was plus or minus 5.5 degrees. That's almost as good as it was in front. So when people tell you, you know, when they're talking about various kinds of spatial audio systems, that human beings are not very good with the accuracy of their localization behind them, it's not true.
Okay.
Okay, and my experience is I've had an argument with a number of people about wave field synthesis, and they say, well, we don't need anything in back because you can't really tell anyway. No, experimental data doesn't show that.
Well, there's all these binaural experiments where they have the big problem is the front-to-back localization. They can't
Yeah.
ambiguity.
They can't tell, and
Yeah.
I'll get to that
Okay.
in a bit. Here's a side view, and this is all about elevation perception, all in the median plane, which is one of the places where people are worst at directional hearing. And dead in front, the localization blur is plus or minus 9 degrees. That means that I can pretty well tell how far things are to the left and right, but up and down, I don't have nearly the accuracy that I do left and right. And here's plus or minus 10 degrees, and here's a really important fact. Straight up, slightly to the back, plus and minus 22 degrees. That's 44 degrees of space in which people really can't tell where the sound source is. So, a practical example of where this is important to know, you know, if you happen to have a facility like the one we have, and people are putting loudspeakers on the ceiling, you know, maybe you don't need to pack them as densely behind people's heads, you know, as you do in other places, because they can't tell what loudspeaker it's coming from anyway. We have a circle of 8 speakers in our big lab above the audience that's up on the ceiling, and you know they're within a space about this big above the audience's heads. And for the truth, people can't tell which loudspeaker the sound's coming from. I mean, not really. So it's a good thing. It's a good thing to know some of these basics about, in this case, perception of direction, because in fact you shouldn't be expecting anything better than this under similar circumstances, right? Just be aware. And so it's probably better to think not of point sources, but to think in terms of spatial attributes. And this is a subject that's well studied by people in the Audio Engineering Society. There's lots of studies of this. And for me, there was a very, very good paper written by Rumsey, one of my favorite papers back in 2002, talking about trying to come up with a short list of spatial attributes. Well, you know, so spatial attributes, you know, then we say, well, what do people really perceive? Well, people don't perceive so much point sources, but they do often perceive things in a more volumetric way. So if you ask people questions, you come finally to the conclusions of things like people do hear that sound sources have width, or that they have height, And that means that's height that's spread, a spread to the sound source. And if you have multiple sound sources together, like in a recording of an ensemble, there's also depth. There's distance, there's direction, you know, and one of the other attributes of spatial hearing is what we call envelopment, that sense of being around, having sound all around you. So this is at least one person's set. I expanded Rumsey a little bit here. This is one person's set of attributes that we know people hear because experiments have been done. People answer questions about all of these things. So there's all this research coming out of the Audio Engineering Society talking about what are the real attributes of the spatiality of sound. You know, this is a literature that people should be paying attention to because this is all practical audio work that's been done. So, the notion of point sources, that audio sources are like point sources, is much better. It's much better to replace that with a notion of spatial attributes like this. So, you know, the way that I think most composers, in fact most audio engineers, discover their misconceptions about spatial audio is through direct encounters with things that don't work. So here's something that doesn't work. This is my question number one. Why doesn't the sound image get wider when I distribute a signal to 3 or more adjacent loudspeakers? Seems like a logical thing to do. Composer has, you know, some sound, you know, they're reproducing a piece in 8 channels, so they take the sound, they put it into loudspeaker A, B, and C, and the reality of what happens is that the listeners only hear the sound located in the closest loudspeaker. It didn't get wider at all. Now, why is that? Well, the answer is the precedence effect. You know, and I think that in people's training, almost everybody hears about the precedence effect, but you know, it often takes time to actually understand the consequences of it. So the precedence effect is a group of phenomena involved in resolving the competition between first arriving and later arriving sound. And what happens here is that, in this example, sounds coming from loudspeakers A, B, and C, the same sound, you know, it's arriving at different times because there are different delays here. And the question is, why does the sound only seem to be coming from loudspeaker C for somebody who's there? So precedence is usually described as something that helps spatial perception in a reverberant space. So we're in a moderately reverberant space here. You're listening to me speak. The sound that's reaching you is coming directly from me, but it's also bouncing off the walls, bouncing off the ceiling, and in fact there's a lot of sound coming from all kinds of different directions. So the auditory system seems to have this wonderful adaptation where it pays attention to the first arriving sound, which is always along the direct path. So the first, every time I say something, the first sound that arrives where you are is what's coming from me. And then there's all these reflections that come later. Okay, so in a reverberant space like this, that's useful because it helps you to understand that the sound's actually coming from me. You give precedence to the first arriving sound. But precedence works the same whether the delayed sound is coming from an environmental reflection or whether it's coming from a distant loudspeaker. So the reality is that to the auditory system, this isn't any different from a reverberant room, and you hear the sound coming from the loudspeaker that's closest to you. So it doesn't do you any good if you want to create a wide sound image to put the same sound in every loudspeaker. If you want to create a wide sound image, what you have to do is overcome precedence, and the best way to do that is through decorrelation techniques, so that what's coming from every loudspeaker is non-identical. If it's non-identical, then you have a wide sound image. When you're doing sound processing, like any kind of granular processing, you know, when people create granular clouds and spread them out in space, you know, even though the sound may seem to be similar from every loudspeaker, temporally it could be the same. In fact, it's not the same, and therefore you get these wonderful clouds of sound. That's an important thing about how that works. So it's important to know various decorrelation techniques if you want to create sound imagery that's broad and volumetric without running into this problem. Another problem. Why does my dynamic panning work sometimes and not others? You know, so people think, okay, I have a pan pot here. I've got some kind of control that's supposed to move the sound, you know, from one loudspeaker to another. I try it, and sometimes it really seems to be working, and sometimes it's not. Usually, what happens, you know, if it's not working, is that the motion of the sound seems very uneven or discontinuous. And it is a very contextual sort of thing. So, why doesn't it work? You know, I don't know how many times, you know, you get some sort of audio tool. I love the 5.1 pan pots, you know, which is a total illusion, you know, because there is, I mean, it doesn't work. And I'll tell you more about that in a second. But particularly, you know, why does this not work? Well, of course, part of this is the precedence effect. Because if these loudspeakers are at different distances from the listener, precedence is going to give the sound from the first arriving loudspeaker the precedence over the other one. So if I'm trying to pan from A to B and B's closer to me, what's going to happen is the sound's going to jump to loudspeaker B much more quickly than the panning suggests it's going to. Now it depends a lot upon the content because a lot of these effects with precedence are dependent upon the temporal character of the sound. So we get this discontinuity when we're trying to pan sometimes, and of course there are other instances of things that work. You know, and if you're an electroacoustic composer and you want to make this work, and you want to make it work for a lot of the listeners in your listening area, not just somebody in the center, you find things that work. One of the things that really works is having rapid reattacks. So when we were talking earlier today about John Chowning's spatialization, and if you ever heard his piece Tyrannus, how long ago
We
was
played
it
it here 2 years ago. Right, there's a poster right there.
Okay. 2
February
years ago.
2000.
Okay, so in Tyrannus, I mean, Chowning was so intelligent in so many ways. You hear this sound that goes big, 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 all
Really
these
worked.
re-attacks, sharp attacks. You know, and even just using 4 loudspeakers, you know, it produced a convincing kind of spatial motion.
Definitely.
Okay, it was the best possible sound source to make this work. So rapid reattacks and high frequency content work better than, well, if you have slow attacks and it's low frequency work and you try to do this, just don't expect it's going to happen. And this is not a matter of what panning technique you're using, because it doesn't matter whether it's amplitude panning, or power panning, or ambisonics, or VBAP. You know, none of them solve this problem, right? It's really important here. And so what this says right away is that, you know, I may think that moving things in space is something that I can do after synthesis, but in fact, if I want to move things successfully in space, the sound material itself has a big influence on what will work. We'll get more to that. Another question. Young composers, you know, they go into, say, an 8-channel room, they work out the spatialization of their piece, they take it into a larger space, and it just doesn't work the same. And usually you don't have enough time in the setup to actually try to figure out what's going on. You play your piece as best you can and adjust it as best you can, but there's something happens from this to that, right? So what's the key factor here? the key factor is the dependence of precedent on the arrival time difference. And the arrival time difference is the time difference between signals arriving from two different loudspeakers. And, you know, and just to get the right sense of the magnitude of the problem, you know, if I have a signal arriving at my ears from one loudspeaker, you know, if the loudspeaker is, say, closer to the left side, it's off to my left, it's going to be louder on the left than it is on the right, and the sound's going to start coming in sooner on the left than it does on the right. There's a little bit of an offset between the ears. But I'm not talking about that kind of an offset. I'm talking about the arrival time difference, because this is the sound arriving from a loudspeaker on the left, and here's the sound arriving from the loudspeaker on the right. What I'm interested in is the time difference between the arrival of the sounds from two different loudspeakers. And why is this important? We have to talk a little bit more about precedence.
Wait, I'm sorry, can you go back? So we're hearing one sound through two loudspeakers? We're hearing two sounds?
Well, it's just like in the situation of panning, where you know, you have the same sound in two loudspeakers, and you have sound coming from both of them, while the sound is supposedly in between the loudspeakers.
Okay.
So it's the same source, right? Same source from two different loudspeakers, but as is typical of every listening position, you know, other than being in the sweet spot, the sound's arriving from one loudspeaker before it's arriving from the other.
Okay, so the person is closer to the left
to this
speaker.
one. Yeah, this person was closer to the left speaker than the right speaker, even though this seems to be louder by the diagram. You know, somewhere in between. Now, the question is, why is the arrival time difference such an important factor? So, this all has to do with the echo threshold. So, talk about psychoacoustics here for a second. This is a typical kind of a setting for studying precedence. And there's a whole lot of studies that have been done of precedence where you have a loudspeaker on the left, you have a loudspeaker on the right, and sound will be played from both of these loudspeakers, only one will be leading in time and one will be lagging in time. So in this case, this is supposedly an experiment set up where the loudspeaker on the right will always be arriving earlier in time than the sound from the loudspeaker on the left. Okay, it's an artificial setup, but I want to know what happens when I vary acoustic aspects of sound arriving. It's the same sound, but coming from two different loudspeakers. Most of these kinds of studies were done to better understand what happens in rooms, but they're doing them with loudspeakers. So that's useful to us because we're doing things with loudspeakers. So here's what happens. What happens is that when the arrival time difference is very small, what happens is that, let's say, when the arrival time difference is 0, you perceive a sound that's directly in between the loudspeakers. And then when the arrival time difference gets up to about 1 millisecond, while it's shifting through 1 millisecond, the sound seems to migrate over to the right. At which point, even though sound's coming from both loudspeakers, it only sounds like it's coming from the right. That took a 1 millisecond difference for that to happen. Okay, and then you're in a region where, as you increase the difference in the arrival time between the two loudspeakers, the sound just seems to be over on the right. It just stays there. It's there, it's there, it's there. The arrival time difference is getting greater and greater. This is the so-called zone of fusion, where even though you have two sounds arriving, they're fused, for your purposes, they're fused into one. And so it goes on like that until you get to some delay where the sound still seems to be coming from the right, but you begin to hear an echo effect from the left. And now at that point, you're at the so-called echo threshold, because there is some arrival time difference at which the late arriving sound gets to be heard. So, it makes sense how a perception works for this zone up here up until the echo threshold. That's why you can hear my voice without hearing all the reflections in the room. That's a useful thing. So it's important to have a sense of this because these delays tell us something about the physical separation or the physical difference in the positioning of loudspeakers that's going to induce these effects when listening to things over loudspeakers. So that's part one of the issue. The next part is that the echo threshold depends upon the source material. And that source material like clicks has an echo threshold of typically around 5 milliseconds. But everything that's less transient than clicks, the echo threshold gets longer and longer and longer. So typical echo thresholds are, they say, between 2 and 50 milliseconds, depending upon the source material. Depends upon the transient character of the source material. That's the dominant thing it depends on. But it's also going to depend upon the frequency range. And transient material has the shortest threshold time. So the echo threshold is highly dependent on the sound source and on the arrival time difference. But you with me? Yeah, go ahead.
I'm with you, but I have a kind of naive question that may be a tangent, but if you had just one loudspeaker and you introduce these same delays, obviously you get comb filter effects. Does that enter into any of this at all?
Yeah. You know,
it's a side issue maybe, but
yeah, when you're listening to these things over 2 loudspeakers, you don't get comb filter effects. If you were doing transients in one loudspeaker, yeah, I suppose there's interference issues. I have to think about that a little bit separately. I mean, obviously, once you start getting beyond 5 milliseconds, it would be less, you would think, wouldn't you? No,
well, comb filters go up to about 10 milliseconds.
No, you're right. No, yeah. So
anyway, it's a side issue.
It's a side issue because there's a timbral effect there. And of course, in rooms there are timbral effects, and you just
but it has to do with
this as a room characteristic.
Yeah, I mean, the question is, does the brain hearing 2 sources in a binaural situation hear a comb filter? I don't think so.
No, almost never.
So that explains it.
Yeah, almost never. Almost never. Okay. But you're with me. It turns out precedence is this really important thing, and precedence varies depending upon the source material and the arrival time difference. So let's go back to our question of what happens. Let's say you're composing for an 8-channel system, and you're working in a small studio, and you take your piece out into a larger space. Something changes. What changes? Okay, so for a listener who's in the sweet spot, what happens is that not much changes. And so if you're only listening to your piece in the sweet spot, you've missed it already. It's your listeners in the audience who are going to, have the difference, or you have to walk around a little bit to find out what the difference is. So let's take the case of a listener who is halfway between the sweet spot in the center and the loudspeaker I've labeled C over there. That's a typical listener in your audience. He's over there on the sides a little bit, okay? And I'm curious to know then, if you've got sound coming out of speakers B and C, or H and B, what happens for that listener when the circle is 4 meters in diameter versus 12 meters in diameter? So I think that's a good sized small studio in comparison to a medium-sized concert hall. I think those are practical diameters there. So let's take B and C, for example, because there's some difference, of course, in the arrival time between B and C, because the listener is obviously closer to C than to B. So if the circle is 4 meters in diameter, there's a dB difference of 3 decibels. And if it goes up to 12 meters, it's still 3 decibels. Because it turns out that amplitude proportions, like decibels are, amplitude ratios, stay the same no matter how large the circle is. The proportion of sound from D to C, that stays in proportion. So it sounds like everything ought to be working fine. But there's a change in the arrival time difference from 1.3 milliseconds to 4.1 milliseconds. You say, well, that's not too bad, but for transient material, some transient material is beginning to approach now an echo threshold. You don't have an echo threshold in the small space, but you have the echo threshold in the large space. The bigger problem, what happens about loudspeakers B and H? Here the amplitude difference stays constant, it's 0.6 decibels. The arrival time difference shifts from 3.9 milliseconds to 11.5 milliseconds. And what happens is, for a lot of your transient material, and material that just has transient attacks, what wasn't over the echo threshold is now over the echo threshold.
So you got two separate sounds.
Now you got 2 sounds, right? And so what happens is that a lot of things that sounded one way to you in the small space now sound different in large space. Okay? So at least you need to be, at least you need to be aware of this, right? You know that difference is there. It's a very subtle thing for people because when they're listening to their piece, the relative loudness always sounds the same. I mean, the dB difference between the loudspeakers didn't change when you scaled up from small to large, but all the arrival time differences got larger. And that's affecting precedence, and affects transient sounds more than it affects more continuous sounds. And so what's happened is that the change in the scaling of the space has affected some sound sources much more than others. Yeah.
It's like this classic pitch shifting effect when you shift something an octave down, all of a sudden it's in a much bigger room.
Yes. Yes. Yep.
All the delay times are double.
All the delay times are bigger. Yeah. So I think that's a reasonable thing to understand. You should just be aware of this, And of course, it's always good to try out your pieces in a large space, before the audience hears them. Anyway, question number 4. Got another one here. Why doesn't my panning work on the sides? Okay, you go into a room, and you've got some kind of complex source, and you've got some sort of panning control that says I can move this thing all the way around. Okay, so try it. And listen, really listen to what's happening. When you move the sound over to the sides, you're not getting anything like the same audio image you've got when you're panning in front or panning in back. What seems to happen is that the sound, if it's a very complex sound, it seems to suddenly get broader, and parts of it are here, parts of it are there, and so you listen carefully and you say, well, okay, I know what I'm thinking when I do this, but am I really getting a sound that sounds like that? So why is there a problem with panning sounds on the sides? And the answer is something that I call image dispersion. And image dispersion is a phenomenon of audio images spreading and shifting between loudspeakers on the side. And this is an example of something complex that comes from a relatively simple situation. You imagine that panning that ought to work the same way all around you, but it doesn't. Okay. So here's an example from a study. This was done by Tiley and Plenge back in 1977. I guess that's where I got this one from. This is panning from a side front loudspeaker to a side rear loudspeaker. And here they are just moving the energy across from what's in front to what's in back. Or I guess maybe this is supposed to be what's in back to what's in front. It doesn't matter here. what happens is when you start moving the panning knob, you know, things seem to be sticking in the rear, and then there's this point where you think you should be panned with an image in between the speakers. What happens is the image is all the way between the loudspeakers. You know, this is standard deviation, and in this region here, what you find is that the image can be anywhere from the front to the back. Okay, and sometimes it's all the way, the front and the back. Okay, so this is not what people think is going to happen. This is what actually does happen. So, why do we get ourselves into trouble over this? You know, first, if we go back to stereo, you know, I think that's where most composers and most audio people, you know, develop their body of experiences that inform how they think. Okay, when I'm working with stereo, I've got a speaker to the left and a speaker to the right, you know, and if I adjust the gain of the left speaker relative to the right speaker, I know that I can create a phantom image between the two loudspeakers. Rather than hearing two sounds, long as the arrival time difference isn't over the echo threshold, I hear one sound, and I can move it anywhere in between, and it works very well. That's a so-called phantom image. But turns out the phantom images are very fragile on the sides. And this has been known in audio engineering circles for a very long time. A very useful report was done back in the era of quad, when people were doing research on this. You know, and this is a report that, you know, most people knew about. It says that it would appear that the stereophonic image phenomenon breaks down at the side of the head. There's all these studies that show this. So you say, okay, there's the problem. You know, the problem is that, you know, I'm trying to pan from the front side to the rear side, and I move the knob. In the middle of that transition, all hell breaks loose. Okay? It doesn't work. Well, that's clever, and you're using the repeated transients like John Chowning. You know, you have sound sources that work. So you say, okay, that was true of quad. This is one of the reasons why quad was such a problem. And what if you go up to 8 channels? Would that solve the problem? Do you just need more channels? Well, it turns out if you actually work out the localization curves for every pair of loudspeakers in an 8-channel setup. And this was done, this is a study that was done not too long ago for an 8-channel setup with a center speaker in the front, so it's a typical American 8-channel setup. It turns out the ideal panning curves are different for every pair of loudspeakers. So when someone's giving you some argument about, well, amplitude panning is better than power panning, or blah, 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 blah. You know, the truth is,
Psychoacoustic panning.
Psychoacoustic panning, you know, gives you a much more nuanced picture, right, of this. And in this study too, this was only done in 2009, when they did this study, they were also asking people to estimate what they called locatedness of the sound. When we're panning between these pairs of loudspeakers, how located is the sound? You know, if the sound is coming from the loudspeaker, it tends to sound, to me it sounds located in the loudspeaker. But if I'm panning between two loudspeakers, there's a point in the middle very often where I'm really not sure how located it is. This is the localization blur. And it turns out even with, you know, 8-channel systems, that in the middle of the panning, there's a point in which the locatedness goes down. Okay, you know, it seems like it's right there, and then in between it's somewhere in there in between. So this problem of image dispersion, you know, is there even in 8-channel systems, if you're really listening to what the spatial imagery sounds like. And this may seem like just a problem, I mean, but it turns out that, you know, people who were listening very carefully in live diffusion have used this as a live diffusion technique in a positive way. Okay, so by the way, talking about 5.1 systems, Tom Holman talks about this and says, oh, never try to pan anything from like the left front to the left rear because of this problem. Don't do it. Audio guys don't do it. But for a lot of people who are doing live diffusion for electroacoustic music, there was an advantage in doing this. Where, say, if you're doing live diffusion and you've got some piece that's only stereo to begin with, and you're doing live diffusion, and you want to give the audience a sense of being surrounded by the sound, well, here's the technique. You take your stereo source, you put it in a front pair of loudspeakers, you put it in a rear pair of loudspeakers, and what happens is, depending upon the complexity of the source, the sound seems to be smeared completely on the side from the left to the right, or from the front to the back. So I can have a stereo source, I place it in front of me on the sides, behind me on the sides, and I balance it correctly. Now I feel completely enveloped by sound, because part of this is in front, part of it is in back, and So this turns out to be a useful way of creating really complex imagery, that gives you the illusion of envelopment. So there was a lot of sense to what people doing the live diffusion with this technique were attempting to do. So, exploited for artistic purposes. Not good for pro audio, but good for art. Okay, we got another question. Well, another one I get from the students. Why don't the recordings I make with binaural mics sound the same as what I hear when I'm there? So people have binaural mics, they discover binaural mics, they go out and they do a lot of field recording.
Maybe explain binaural.
Yeah, and so I got a little picture here. These are usually very small microphones, and that you can buy these things very, very cheaply, because if you have a portable stereo recorder, this is a great thing to do. You put the microphones right on the edge of your ears, or you can actually find insert mics that go sort of inside the ears. So you're recording with your head as an acoustic baffle. So you've got a left channel and a right channel, you've got the head in between. And when you listen to a recording that's done this way, you listen to it with headphones, it has a lot of three-dimensional imagery in it. But it doesn't really sound quite the same as being there. Hoarding that is embodying some of the acoustic information that the auditory system uses in perceiving things in 3 dimensions. I know in everyday life, I perceive sound in 3 dimensions. I can't do that with a single microphone. It doesn't work if I just use a pair of mics. But if I have a head in between, what happens is that I'm capturing in the recording process differences between the 2 ears in a way that mimics or is actually using the head to create these differences. So what happens is the head is a fairly complicated thing acoustically, and when a sound source occurs in the natural environment, if I'm measuring what comes from that sound source with these microphones inside the ears, there's a difference between the ears and the time at which things arrive, and there's also a difference in the intensity, and the time difference and the intensity difference are frequency dependent. It's a very complex set of relationships, and if you bundle it all together, you have what's called a head-related transfer function. That is, how did the head affect what sound was arriving, say, at the ear canal? So, if you do recordings with microphones inside the ear, you have a lot of the acoustical information that people use every day to tell where things are in 3-dimensional space. It's a great thing to do. And it doesn't really sound like being there. One of the problems is that if you listen to binaural recordings, and by the way, there's a whole culture of people who go to live concerts and record the live concert with mics inside their ears and put these things up on the internet, and so you can listen to old Grateful Dead concerts through somebody else's ears, and they're lots of fun, long as they don't move their head too much while they're That's hard to do at a Grateful Dead concert, isn't it? Yeah, I had one composer once tell me about getting neck pain because he was listening to a recording and somebody moved their head and oh gee, I don't know, my ears are going. Say, give him a neck pain. I don't know. Anyway, you're listening to this recording of being in a concert of the Grateful Dead, and you can hear the crowd all around you. You can hear the crowd behind you. You have this wonderful sense of being there, but there's nothing in front. Somehow they're somewhere floating in space, or they're close to your head or something. And it turns out that one of the typical problems with binaural recordings is that you can't get imagery in front. It turns out there's a certain percentage of people who don't get it in back, but most people don't get it in front. And that's because even though you've got a head, that's there, and you've got the mics right inside the ear canal, and you're getting all the acoustic information that would normally go into the ear canals when you're there, one thing is missing, which is your dynamic head movement. That what happens is, no matter how good the recording is, when you move your head, the sound isn't changing. That whatever the listener was doing with your head and with their head and what you're doing with your head are not synced. So what happens is that to tell the difference between something in front of you and behind you, you need to be moving your head. And human beings move constantly. I remember being at a presentation of a paper someone had done, and I think this was in auditory display, where the military had done a study where they would bring a Marine into the middle of a room, and they would say, "Marine, don't move," and they would leave. And of course, they've got some camera focus on the guy, and of course, he moves. He can't help it. Human beings move constantly. If you've measured, if you try not to move, how much you move. But anyway, it turns out that moving is really important for telling whether the sound's in front of you or behind you. That dynamic motion, your interaction with the environment. So, the inaural differences, the head-related transfer functions that you get for doing a binaural recording are missing head movement. So they don't sound like being there because you're not there moving the way you would when the recording was done.
So if we really want to localize something, maybe an expert would go in and be moving their head all the time to find out where something was.
Yes.
Really localize it.
Yeah, and it's,
to get it from all angles.
Yeah.
And what about the filtration through the pinna?
Yeah, well, that's what we're saying is captured mostly by the head. I didn't mention pinna, but yes, what happens is, you notice that the outer ear here is sort of facing forward. So if you do a spectral analysis of sound that's in front coming into the ear canal versus sound that's behind you coming into the ear canal, there's a big difference. And it ought to be a difference that you think would allow you to always tell when something's in front and what's behind. It's yes and no. Sometimes it'll help you, but a lot of times it doesn't. But the trouble is that, even if I have that difference there, if I move my head and the sound doesn't change in response to my movement of my head, the auditory system does a very sensible thing. Where could the sound be if I move my head and it doesn't change? Let's see if we think about this. That can't be there. No, that doesn't think. Where would the sound have to be if I move my head and nothing changes?
On the top.
Yeah.
Well, inside your head, right? So when you're listening to your iPod or your iPhone, the stereo recordings. I mean, where is the sound?
Right.
It's inside your head, right? It makes perfect sense because you're moving around and the sound isn't changing. So the sound space basically it has to be inside your head. It's the only logical place it can be. You're used to your voice being inside your head, So being attached to an environment when you're moving is a really important thing for telling what's in front of you and what's behind you, and you can use binaural recordings and you can use head-related transfer functions, but there's a limit to how far they can help you by themselves. So what happens when you're doing these kinds of recordings? You know, what kind of errors do you have? The typical error is that you make mistakes about what's in front of you versus what's behind you. That's the typical mistake. I'm listening to the Grateful Dead, but in truth, they sound like they're behind me, you know. The other thing that happens is a lack of externalization, like what happens with typical stereo recordings. You know, I have spatial information coming into my ears, but somehow it's not outside of me, it's inside of me. So those are our two big problems, you know, is front-back reversals and lack of externalization. So if you want to make this work, it's not a big mystery how to make this work. If you ever hear a system that does this, it works marvelously well. If you want to produce headphone sound that really sounds like things are in front of you and that they're outside, what you have to do is get all the acoustics of the head-related transfer function, and you have to dynamically track head movement and make the changes at the ears as your head moves. So I mean, the military has great machines that do this. You know, you put on a pair of headphones, there's a little thing on top that monitors your head position, and then they're processing the sound in real time. So if I move my head to the right, they automatically track my head movement, make the changes at the ears, so that if something's supposed to be in front of me and I do this, the sound changes at the ears the way it should, and it sounds in front of me. You know, so you can get something that's very, very close to the kind of experience of sound being around you in 3 dimensions, you know, like you do in regular life, but at the cost that you have to be processing the sound dynamically as the listener's head is moving. And if you do that, it's great. I mean, you know, all kinds of simulators that have headphones in them can do this sort of thing, and it's a very convincing effect. Pretty good.
But you couldn't use this with sound that was recorded binaurally with a moving person.
No, you can't. You have to simulate. You know, you have to simulate it, and that means that if you're doing a room simulation, when I move my head, it's not just the sound from the source that has to change. It's all the reflections in the room have to change in a reasonable way too. Of course, I can get close approximations by cheating quite a lot. Sometimes that's a very useful thing to do in art. You know, cheat quite a lot and get it to work. So that's what you need to do to make your binaural recordings work. Otherwise, you know, binaural recordings are great, except for usually the missing material that ought to be in front, which isn't. Okay, that's why binaural recordings don't sound like being there. Next question. What goes wrong with the 3D effect when I play my binaural recordings over loudspeakers? You think, well, yeah, I did a binaural recording. I play it in my living room or my studio, and I listen to it, and something's happening, but I can't tell what. It's very confused. Yes, it's very confused, because the person doing this is very confused. Because what happens is that when you play a binaural recording over loudspeakers, you know, you have something you recorded for the left ear, which is going to get to the left ear. But it's also going to go around the head and get into the right ear. And you have something you recorded for the right ear. It's going to get into the right ear, but it's also going to get over into the left ear. And this is acoustic crosstalk. That is, now I don't have the left and right ears isolated anymore. I've got sound from each loudspeaker going across the head and getting to the other side. And, well, this is a solvable problem acoustically. I mean, it was done a long time ago. I mean, there's a famous paper by Manfred Schroeder back in 1963 where he came up with an idealized solution for this. And you can do a lot of acoustic processing. It's still a lot of processing on the sound for the left and the right, and so as to eliminate the influence of crosstalk. But it's something that's really only appropriate for small space reproduction. You have to know exactly where the listener's head is in relationship to the loudspeakers. But these solutions are out there, and you can find these things, you can download them, you know.
What's the quickly, what is the nature of the solution?
The nature of the solution, okay, is that, well, okay, so take the left speaker, right, the left signal comes to that ear, and this one comes around to that ear. But I know exactly where the listener's head is. So I'll generate an extra signal on the right speaker that when it comes in, it arrives just at the right time with reverse phase to cancel out.
The old phase reverse trick.
Phase reverse trick. And then, of course, there's lots of complications.
Good luck with that one.
Yeah, and of course, you know, there are, I mean, what happens is there's a lot of different variations on how to do this, but it works, I'd say, reasonably well in a small space monitoring. And, you know, and there's also, you can also do head tracking.
Yeah,
on
you'd
the
have to
listener.
head track, right.
Okay, all of that, okay,
Right.
so, okay, but, you know, don't take your binaural recordings, play them over loudspeakers and expect anything coherent to happen. Okay.
You're supposed to play them through headphones.
Just play them through headphones, right? And enjoy the Grateful
State
Dead.
the audio.
Enjoy the Grateful Dead inside your head and behind you.
Right.
Okay. Okay. Here's another good one. Why do some phantom images seem to be higher than the loudspeakers? If you know, any audio engineer knows when they're doing a mix that, you know, things aren't on the plane. Not all things are on the plane between the loudspeakers. Paul McCartney knows this. This is one of a whole bunch of drawings he put in to his album, Press to Play, where he drew pictures of what he wanted the audio imagery to be like for each of his tracks, right? And there's other audio engineers who will do diagrams like this. I kind of like seeing Paul McCartney's. So on his track Press, he says, well, here's the solo guitar, here's the bass sequence there's the vocal. He's drawing where everything is. And you notice that as you get down toward the left speaker, everything is collapsing in the left speaker. And you get down toward the right speaker, everything's collapsing in the right. But in the middle, things are quite spread out in terms of elevation. Every audio engineer who does any kind of stereo monitoring knows that this is the reality. This is what happens. So, why is this happening? Well, I think the clearest explanation is that the head-related transfer functions, you know, when you get all the acoustics that head involved, for elevation, are confounded with source spectral characteristics. So I have a virtual source, you know, that's ought to be somewhere in between the loudspeakers, and let's say it's fairly high. You know, it has a high spectral centroid. It's a high pitch. Well, it gets lifted up. It gets lifted up because the auditory system can't tell the difference between a source that has a high spectral centroid and a sound that's elevated. It's the same spectral shaping that's the cue for elevation and is part of the timbre of the sound. Timbre and elevation are completely confounded with one another. It's not to say that you can't unconfound them sometimes, but in normal listening they're quite confounded with one another. So things are going to tend to be higher or lower, especially as virtual images, just because of the nature of the sound itself. Okay. And you know, I think honestly, you know, if you go to an orchestra concert and you close your eyes, you'll have to admit that the basses are lower in elevation than the violins. And the piccolo plays, it's up here, and the basses are down there. That's just the way people hear it. So, you know, every audio engineer knows this. It's a natural phenomenon. We shouldn't be surprised. In the Sonic Lab, where I am in Belfast, we have this large room that has loudspeakers at the level of the audience, halfway up to the ceiling, on the ceiling, and then it turns out the floor is a metal mesh, and we have another circle of loudspeakers underneath the audience. Women have a terrible time with high heels here. Okay, you can't do this in high heels. Okay, so anyway, what happens, your experience of what you learn is what happens when you're trying to pan sounds in 3 dimensions in this room, is that when you pan things across the front, they work fairly well. When you pan them across the side, what's going to happen?
Blurry.
They're going to be blurred. Okay. What happens when you try to pan things up? Well, what happens is that there's a point at which the sound disassociates from the loudspeaker situation, the loudspeaker's location, and the sound localizes in elevation depending upon its nature and depending upon its spectral content. So often you can take material. This is so easy to do. You can play it underneath of people, the loudspeakers on the floor, and depending upon how high it is, they'll say it's here or there. You can play things in the ceiling. People have no idea where it's coming from, but they'll pick an elevation that depends upon the source material. Basses go down, strings go up. So the exception that cues people to where things really are attack transients, because attack transients have energy at all frequencies, and you can pretty well localize attack transients, where they really are. The other thing that happens is that very often the attack transients go where the loudspeakers are, and the rest of the sound seems to be somewhere else. So, like on a lot of synthesized sounds where you get a really sharp, noisy attack, and then there's a continuous part, they seem to be in 2 different locations. The attack transients in the loudspeakers, and the continuous part is down where it is depending upon pitch. That's the reality.
So can I ask a question? Can you go
Yeah.
back? So is Paul McCartney naive to think he can put the bass at the top of his image here?
I think that's a bass with a big tack transient on it. That tells me that his bass has a big tack transient on it. So he's not actually putting the bass there, he's putting the of the attack up there. Very observant of you.
Paul McCartney knows where his bass sounds go.
He knows.
He would know.
Yeah. Anyway, so here's one that a question that has come up frequently when composers are doing frequency domain processing, because this is an idea that just seems to have caught on and almost always produces the same result. And this is, why do I hear a single image when I put the harmonics of the sound into different loudspeakers? And I went to a talk given by a composer where he had taken a cello and he had analyzed the cello and set each of the harmonics in different loudspeakers. And we're listening in a room that had at least, at least 16 loudspeakers. And so he's talking about how big the sound is. And we're listening. Yeah. Then he uses a flocking algorithm, and the harmonics are moving around the room, and we see this graphic of all the flocking. And what does everybody hear? They hear a cello. That's all they can hear is a cello. And sometimes a bit focused and a bit unfocused, but basically you hear one image. Now, the harmonics were scattered all over the room. So what happened? This seems like such an obvious thing to do. When you're doing frequency domain processing of sounds, it sounds like this is something that's just so handy to do. People have been doing this for a couple of decades. Anyway, what for me is happening here is that there's a cue conflict going on, where the synchronization of the harmonics is telling the auditory system that there's a single source to the sound, and that the coordination of the motion of the harmonics, is telling the auditory system to fuse that into a single source, while the spatial location of the harmonics is telling you there are multiple images. And so one thing is at conflict with the other. Who wins? Well, spectral fusion wins. Hands down, no problem. So if you have all these sounds distributed, all over, let's say in a room around you, and let's say you put the vibrato, the identical vibrato and everything, you're going to get a single image. So there is a solution to this problem, which is that you have to desynchronize the harmonics. You can take all the harmonics from a cello.
Decorrelation again.
Another kind of decorrelation, right? For most people who are doing this frequency domain processing, the easiest thing to do is put different time delays on each harmonic.
Granulated. That's the
Granulated,
solution
that
to
would be
everything.
yes, there we go. So, you know, there's a
Time-tested
famous,
decorrelation technique.
yeah, there's a famous example that Steve McAdams used to play people that is just fabulous for this. And I'll describe the example, which is that you're listening to stereo loudspeakers and he plays you something that sounds like an oboe. And the oboe is directly in between the two loudspeakers. And then something begins to happen and the oboe becomes unstable and suddenly it splits out to something on the left and something on the right. And on the left, I think you get a soprano voice that's singing a note an octave higher, and on the other side you get a clarinet. I say it was fabulous timbre interpolation. You know, how did he do that? He was playing the same thing for you all the time, but changing the vibrato. So in the middle, you've got odd harmonics from one side and even harmonics from the other. But when they have the same vibrato, they fuse into a single source that sounded like an oboe. And when he put different vibrato on them, the even harmonics went to one side, producing a note an octave higher. You know, the odd harmonics went to the other, producing a clarinet sound. The only thing was manipulated was vibrato. And he uses that as an example to show that spectral fusion trumps timbre, trumps pitch, trumps spatial location. Okay, so it's the same problem here. You know, you can get the intended effect, but you have to decorrelate or granulate the individual components so that the auditory system treats them as separate sources. So, to the end here, getting things right. Okay, so what did we have to know in order to solve all of these problems? You know, the answer to question one was the precedence effect. The answer to question effect, everybody knows about it, but it takes a while to actually figure out what it's doing to you. Question number 4 had to do with the asymmetry of multi-channel localization. How panning works one way in the front, but doesn't work the same on the side. It's not symmetric. You can't just go around the circle that way. Questions 5, 6, and 7 all had to do with directional hearing and head-related transfer functions, and the role of head movement, how important head movement is. And finally, question 8 was, about the interrelationship of spatial hearing with auditory fusion and stream segregation. There we go. I think we think of the conceptual foundation that's missing for most people. I think that mostly is right here. Here's all these practical problems that people encounter, and here's the conceptual foundation for them. So, conclusions. Tell me, mass man, what's your conclusions? Okay. My one big conclusion. There is no silver bullet that solves everything. That's the most important thing to know.
Did the people in the UK understand that when you make that?
I got laughs. I got laughs.
Do they know what the silver bullet is?
I don't know, but enough people laughed that, I wondered about that. I'm showing my age here, I don't know, by saying that I know and admire the masked man.
Right.
Okay.
Wait, I thought silver bullet was a reference to werewolves.
Aha. They were laughing for the wrong reason, huh?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I gotta do something else. But one point is, I guess I want to argue to people who are sort of fanatical or ideological about systems, that there's no system that's a solution. The things I'm talking about don't depend upon whether you're using ambisonics or VBAP or whatever. All of this is here. Those systems, ambisonics and VBAP, are all conceived around a listener at the sweet spot. And when you're not in the sweet spot, all these problems I'm describing are all there.
Yeah.
Okay, so answers depend on the context, the specific context, and understanding spatial perception and cognition. I mean, you've got a conceptual foundation here. If you understand that, these things are not so difficult to work out and negotiate. Yeah.
I would just say that in this number 2 point that even if you're in the sweet spot, there's still localization blur and all these other effects. So
Yeah.
it really doesn't solve that problem.
Yeah, the image dispersion.
It's also idealized.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Image dispersion happens regardless.
Right.
Right, this is going to happen. Okay, so a couple more things to say. and multi loudspeaker sound reproduction in particular, I think this is important. The notion that spatial perception is uniform, as signals are uniformly panned around multiple loudspeakers, is just way too simple. Okay, everybody wishes that worked, but it doesn't work. Okay, so I think if you want really good control over sound localization, you have to be thinking about that in conjunction with the synthesis, right from the start. Okay, and the notion that spatial perception is independent of the source characteristics is also too simple. Thinking that you have a spatialization system and you can put some sound into it, and that whatever you're doing in spatialization is going to be the same, independent of the sound source, still way too simple. Attack transients, the frequency, centroid, all of this stuff is going to affect things. And then, in headphone reproduction, the notion that binaural recordings with HRTFs capture complete spatial hearing cues is too simple. Don't disappoint yourself. Okay. So now I'm ready for more questions, if you have any more questions. Yeah.
Well, I mentioned the pinna before because
Yeah.
when you talk about characteristics of sounds when they go up and down,
Yeah.
if you fold your ears over, you begin to perceive a totally different direction.
Yeah.
And so I imagine that if one were to try and do a nice panning from the top to the bottom,
Yeah.
that you could probably filter the sounds in such a way that your ear, somehow one would have to measure how the pinna filters high sounds from low, spatially high and spatially low sounds, and then treat the sounds you're doing automatically.
Yes.
If Vincent van Gogh had cut off his other ear,
Yeah.
and he listened to a binaural thing, he would probably be able to understand directions that if he'd done the recording, nobody else would.
Yeah. Wouldn't want to put binaural mics in his ears. In case, no. But in fact, it's not very hard to do this. If you have a set of HRTFs changing in elevation, it's easy to demonstrate that the spectral centroid of the HRTFs goes up with elevation. You can graph it out, and it's very easy to see.
Is it linear, more or less?
Oh, is it linear? Well, it's continuous. I don't know. I don't know how.
Monotonic, at least.
Monotonic. It's at least monotonic. Yeah. And I don't think it's as simple as simply knowing what the centroid is. It's a little bit more complex. So all I want to claim is that there's a parallel between the elevation, the perceived elevation, and the spectral centroid.
Have you heard the effect in SoundHack, or Tom Arab's?
Yeah.
Basically works. It's putting a high-pass filter in. Definitely.
Yeah. In computer auditory display, there's a number of people have written papers where when they want to create illusion of elevation, they use bandpass noise or some bandpass signal, and it's perfectly obvious. I mean, people hear this and that and that. It's not difficult to do. Not at all difficult to do. So, okay. Other things? Have I encouraged you to do more spatial sound, or have I discouraged you? Keep it simple. Listen to what's actually
Stay with stereo.
No, what I found is I sometimes hear what I want to hear.
Yes. Composers.
Have to have somebody else.
Well,
tend to do that.
that's another problem, Claire. That's a confession.
Yeah.
But this is like the whole audio industry is very often built on what are your intentions. You look at something like, you look at some fancy looking great big loudspeaker and you say, oh, that has fabulous sound, doesn't it? Yeah, maybe not. They sell, they take advantage of, how hard it is sometimes these things, to hear these things without secondary cues coming in to reinforce it, to sell you things that don't work so well sometimes.
Yeah.
The fancy cabinetry kind of makes things sound better with loud.
Yeah, it does.
Amazing. You know, and one of the things I tell people, you know, is that when they buy loudspeakers, and you know, you go into the audio store and they have a special listening room, and you're auditioning these things, and they sound so fabulous. You take them home, and you can put them into a room with hard surfaces and reflecting surfaces near the loudspeaker, and you could have saved $1,000 and just bought a cheaper pair of speakers to begin with, because if the room isn't working, you're not going to hear what you heard in the showroom. You know, it isn't there. I had a friend once who, you know, kept at me until I came to his home because he had spent I don't know how many thousands of dollars on some pair of speakers, and he was so happy. And he took me to his listening room, and he had one wall was almost like a glass surface, and then there was a hard wooden floor. And there's all these walls that were completely bare. And the truth was, you couldn't tell where the loudspeakers were in the room. I mean, you just couldn't tell. He thought it was fabulous. He had paid all those thousands of dollars. And,
Confirmation bias.
Yeah. So, yeah, it sounded great. You know, fabulous, you know. But
So the
people do
question
this
is,
sort of
did
thing.
you lie to him, or
Say again?
did you tell him what you really heard?
Yeah, I think I think he was investing money in one of my companies, you know. And so I was very generous to him. Yeah. Yeah. Anything else?
You've definitely confirmed a lot of what I've seen with the software I've made, because the interface I have makes it very easy to produce these kind of effects and split sounds into their spectral components and spatialize those separately. But if you don't decorrelate them, like that's an example where it sounds the same, or just duplicating sound sources. You know, I have delay effects in there, so you can just quickly make several delays of the same sound, and then you get the imagery, or just Doppler shift if you move them all quick enough. That's another way to do it. So
Yeah. I mean, a Doppler shift would be, in a way, it's a kind of a way of decorrelating vibrato patterns. You know, if one sounds Doppler shifting before another, they're going to segregate. You know, so there's all those wonderful things. You know, I think that for me, one of the great questions, you know, after you digest this, is to think about, okay, what do you really actually want to do with spatial audio? You know, if moving around point sources is really not the nature of the business that we're in here with spatial audio, you know, what do you want to do with spatial audio, then there's a world of possibilities that open up for thinking about spatial audio in some other way, I think. And that's where the interesting creative part comes in.
All right, thank you
Great.
very much.
Thank you.